Men used to be manlier. It's not the trope, it's true. Reuters has this story from back in 2007. Men's testosterone levels declined in the last 20 years. And we have this story from Forbes. You are not the man your father was. Among millennial men, your T levels are getting low. Many of you may be familiar with the famous video from the Try Guys. I think they were with BuzzFeed. They went out and got their testosterone levels checked, and boy, was it bad. These young men, who I believe were in their 20s, had testosterone levels equal to that of 80-year-old men. I don't necessarily blame the guys, I guess. I can blame our culture. I can blame our parents. And, one of the things you can do, my understanding, to increase T levels is exercise, work out, lift some weights, eat some red meat. But we are a nation of increasing femininity. And we have in the media the constant berating of men being told that they're toxically masculine, which is not true. There certainly is toxic masculinity, but most men are just positively masculine. But as we demonize men more and more and more, there is one direction we are headed towards, my friends, and it's very simple: communism. And you can blame the women. I'm kidding, by the way. I'm only half kidding, actually. Which brings me to the main point of this segment. A story from the New York Times. The gender gap is taking us to unexpected places. How surprising would it be to many of you to find that communism arises out of more feminine viewpoints and cultural desires? This is not to demonize women or say they're wrong. In fact, I think the feminine viewpoint is important, nay, essential to a functioning society. But as with toxic masculinity, there is also toxic femininity. And if you have an imbalance is where the problem arises. And today, my friends, the problem has arisen. Now, if I take a look at maybe some traditional values or individuals who express them, you have the mother and the father, the man's role and the woman's role, and how they complement each other and create a functioning and successful society. But what happens when women are suppressed and oppressed? You become cold and violent, more prone to taking risks. And this is, I'm not making this up, actually data. When female influence enters the political space, war is less likely. This is actually what we're reading from the New York Times. The problem we face now is an inversion. It appears that authoritarianism may become more likely as women start getting a disproportionate amount of power. To put it simply, this is me basically saying it appears, based on my assessment, that the appropriate level of male-female balance is equal. But we don't have equal right now. We have, among millennial women, 70% are Democrat. And among Republicans, it's fairly evenly split between men and women, but slightly less women are Republicans. This says to me that as male testosterone decreases, as many men start behaving very weakly and becoming less charismatic, less prone to risk-taking, you get you get a disproportionate amount of femininity in a government, which leads to authoritarianism. And I'm going to back this up not just with the science, but I also have an interesting article about the Russian Revolution and how women at the time were seen as overwhelmingly conservative. But many of you may say, Tim, that makes no sense. Women are progressives. They're left. No, they're communal and authoritarian. And this explains a whole lot about everything. But let me start by reading the story from the New York Times, which breaks down the gender gap is taking us to unexpected places. Well, I think if you've been reading this news for the past 20 years, you're probably not surprised by this. I have not been researching this stuff that long, and I'm not surprised by this because I've read stories like this for a while now, going back several years. Now, they go on to say, blah, blah, blah. They did studies. They found women are more likely to be in college and all of these things. They say while liberal and left identification among female students reached a high in 2016, male students remained far below their 1971 high. The interesting thing here is that males used to be more left-leaning than women. But alas, let me just point out, there's something you need to understand about the semantics here and how left and right shift and change. I'm going to make a bold statement right now and just tell you outright that if we are going by the classical terminology of left and right, it is fair to say that it may be fair to say that, say, Hassan, the left wing, as he's called, streamer, is actually further right wing than I am, as is Vosh. And this is going back to the classical definitions of left and right from the French Revolution, where the right were the aristocracy, they wanted a status quo, and the left were the revolutionaries. If you watch my show or you watch Timcast, we're fairly reformist to revolutionary. We are not overtly revolutionary, nonviolent, but we are also very anti-establishment and anti-status quo to a certain extent. We like the Constitution, but we call for radical changes in this country. When it comes to massive multinational corporations, the populist view tends to be they're exploiting the working class. Now, you may end up in this weird situation where the aristocracy and the proletariat left, whatever they want to call themselves, are in alignment, which is strange, but it doesn't mean it's true. When we do a show on Timcast IRL where we rag on uniparty establishment politics from the left and the right, we're critical of Donald Trump but defend him in certain respects. We call for, say, abolishing the Federal Reserve, and we want the legalization of recreational drugs. These are all fairly revolutionary ideas. Now, we respect the Constitution because it safeguards human rights, but that's not reactionary. In fact, Luke went on a rant the other day against Donald Trump. Yet for some reason, you get the likes of Hassan and Vosh, and I single them out, but they're pro-massive multinational corporation and status quo government mandating medical procedures on people. That's a big one for me. That's very, very big. Now, Hassan has talked about how he wants to nationalize the medical industry, but that's still not revolutionary. That's actually authoritarian and backs up a lot of my points. If the power structures are currently in place, the big pharmaceutical companies, they're already in power. And the response from the left is to enshrine their power at a national level that's not left-wing in the classical sense. That's actually in support of the aristocracy. It would enshrine their powers. Now, of course, maybe they're saying they want to completely dismantle the system and replace those who are in charge with someone else that still bolsters the intelligentsia and the intellectual elites in the revolution, in their version of the revolution. I do think it's fair to say, in reality, left and right are completely meaningless. And it's stupid to argue that I or they or anybody is left or right, and they're just tribal signifiers at this point. But let's get back to gender and the significance here. They go on to say, a Knight Foundation survey in 2017 of 3,014 college students asked, if you had to choose, which do you think is more important? A diverse and inclusive society or protecting free speech rights? Men, 61-39 in favor of free speech. Women, 64-35 in favor of diverse society. Majorities of both male and female college students in the Knight Foundation survey support the view that the First Amendment should not be used to protect hate speech. But the men were more equivocal at 56-43 than women at 71-29. So when you hear hate speech must be banned, it is women overwhelmingly saying this. But could it be that it is directly tied to testosterone and those who have taken high levels of testosterone being more or having natural high levels being more prone to risk taking? That is to say, I understand the problems of hate speech. However, I think the risk is worth the reward. We can't just lock down and keep everything safe. And therein lies the advance towards communism, authoritarianism, corporatism, or fascism. The more feminine a person is, the more likely they are to prefer safety over risk. Now, far be it from me to pretend like I'm an evolutionary psychologist, but I'd be interested in hearing the thoughts of, say, Brett Weinstein, or is that how you pronounce it? I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Or any other evolutionary biologist and psychologist to discuss the ideas as to why it is women tend to prefer safety and men tend to take risks. One hypothesis, and this actually may be theoretical, it may be considered scientific fact for now, I don't know, is that men are disposable. So in the early nomadic tribes of humanity, women must be protected and kept safe because they were creating and nurturing life. However, you don't need that many men to create and nurture life, but you do need many women. So what happens is the men are able to take risks because if they die, you still have some men to have babies with the women. But the women, those who create life, if you lose women, then you struggle to make more babies, and thus a natural tendency emerged. Women that preferred safety tended to survive more, and a society that protected women was more likely to produce more babies, and as such, the majority of humanity tends to flow in that direction. It's not absolute, but that's how evolution tends to work. I'm not saying any of that's true. I'm just saying it's my personal hypothesis off of reading a lot of this information. They go on to say, The data on college students reflects trends in the electorate at large. The Pew Research Center provided the Times with survey data showing that among all voters, Democrats are 56% female, while Republicans are 52% male, for a combined gender gap of 18 points. Pew found identical gender splits among voters who identify as liberal and those who identify as conservative. I'd like to throw it back to Vox.com, an article I've referenced quite a bit. June 20th, 2018, Republicans have a millennial women problem. Nearly 70% of young women say they are leaning toward Democratic candidates in the midterms. Now, why is that? My opinion is status quo, safety, no taking risks. I'd like to bring you back in time, my friends, to the Bolshevik Revolution. From the website bolshevik.info, not entirely sure if it's the most factual historical assessment, but they do say this, and I find it interesting. Before the revolution, okay, so this is the Soviet Revolution, mind you. Before the revolution, women were seen as the most conservative layer of the working class, being directly responsible for care of the family. They often hesitated and were even opposed to taking strike action. But this turns into its exact opposite when living conditions had become intolerable. With the lack of bread, the spiraling inflation, and with many of them with their husbands fighting on the front. Thus, women workers, especially in textile industries, having reached the limit of what was humanly endurable, decided to take action. Steve Bannon mentioned this. We had him on the show. He said, in the French Revolution, it wasn't until the women came out and marched that the revolution actually happened. Men are willing to take risks and stand up, but women, less likely so. It wasn't until in the Bolshevik Revolution that women felt they were so strained that the safest course of action was revolution that it actually occurred. What that means is that in the status quo, as bad as everything had gotten in the pre-Soviet Russia, women were unwilling to strike. Men had pointed out there was a very serious problem, something they were unhappy with. Food was harder and harder to come by. And then women said, I don't want to engage. It is not safe. Now, maybe that's an unfair assessment. By all means, criticize me and comment below as to what you think. But it seems like women being less more averse to risk, not wanting to engage, it was only when it was so obvious to them that they had no food and change needed to occur, that they actually rose up and took political action. What do we have now? Well, in the United States, we have hardcore authoritarianism across the board. Vaccine mandates. Why? It's safe. Now, in my opinion, I actually think it's risky. But if you are trusting of the establishment and the status quo and they come out and tell you this is safe, you are more likely to adhere to the authority as opposed to risk venturing off and doing something drastic for which you have no data. I can actually respect the position, but there is a tendency between men and women to differ in this regard. I once worked for a company where I was one of 5 directors, and I believe the other 4 were female. The company was having very serious problems. We were the ones running it, so we had to make a decision. My decision was dramatic, risky change. It may hurt us in the short term, but our long-term prospects will greatly improve. I was voted against. The women said, and this is a direct, I'll paraphrase a bit, but almost a direct quote. I was told it's just a storm and we must weather it. Stay the course. My response was, the ship is sinking, and if we don't take a dramatic change and venture off into a direction for which we know very little, we will sink. My attitude, and I firmly believe this was, we may not know what lies to the west, but we do know if we keep going straight, we will stay in a storm. The response from them was, but if we stay through the storm and stay the course, our plan will work and storms happen. It's not wrong to assume, but I found it interesting as I reflected upon it that my reaction was take the risk. We know not what lies in that direction, but it's better than staying in bad weather. And their response was, what we've done has always worked, so stay the course and the storm will end. Of course, in the end, I was proven right to a certain degree. Now, we still don't know what lied due west of our ship in this storm, but the company failed. And they failed miserably. A lot of people got fired, things didn't work out very well, and maybe the best bet would have been the risk, even if we didn't succeed. But when I take a look at these historical revolutions, from the French Revolution to the Communist Revolution, it says to me that, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, women have a desire to maintain the status quo because it's the safest option. And that's really important. Men can do dumb things. I mean, men speed in cars going 120 miles an hour and crashing and dying, and women don't do those things. So what's my point in all this? To me right now, I think one of the biggest problems in our country is the feminization of men and the disproportionate amount of power among more feminine voices. Women are essential to a functioning society, and they, in my opinion, need to have a role in government and policy, but it needs to be well balanced with the masculine view. There needs to be an honest assessment of risk-taking versus risk aversion. But when you have nothing but risk aversion, you're driving towards a cliff while someone is screaming at you, look, I understand we might crash, but we're going to go off a cliff if we don't move. In some instances, you will have a guy saying, we have no choice but to turn, and it turns out the woman is correct. The point is, if you're having a rational and honest discussion about the way we're supposed to be going, it seems like you need a positive male and masculine and feminine voice in this picture, but we're not getting that. Overwhelmingly, we're getting a more feminine take on things. And what I mean by this, like to back it up, is when our culture is moving heavily towards censoring hate speech, and that is the feminine perspective, we are imbalanced, and this is going to create problems. Yes, I don't like hate speech, but we understand why we accept the risks of it to a certain degree. The feminine view is no, 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 shut it down. It's unsafe. And what have we been hearing endlessly? Safety, 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 vaccine mandates. And what's happened? Our economy is collapsing. It's about time we take the masculine approach, or at least balance out the approach and say, can we have safety while still accepting some risk? Because if we only do safety, bad things happen. From NPR, 2018, female voters' marriage gap in the midterms. Married women tend to have more conservative beliefs and vote for more Republicans, while single women tend to be aligned more with Democrats. That dynamic may shift in this year's midterms. That's 2018. Now, it could be that women who are conservative are more likely to get married. It could be that women with a masculine presence in their lives are more likely to vote Republican. I don't know. I do think it's, however, important to point out that 70% of young women are leaning Democratic. Perhaps it is just that women who are conservative get married, like I said. But suffice it to say, as more and more young people aren't getting married and having kids, you are going to get an increasingly more feminine electorate and political body. In which case, in my opinion, without the proper balance of male and female energy, you could collapse. Did you guys see The Matrix? Spoiler alert for those that didn't see it. It's been out for some time now, but that's basically the premise of The Matrix. Again, I'm going to say spoiler alert, but the premise of the movie, as much as many people tried claiming it was woke and all that, was that the system could not survive without the male and the female presence and the yearning for each other. I thought that was particularly conservative. I mean, think about it. If men and women don't want to be together, the matrix collapses. That was the premise. So the idea was the initial matrix didn't survive and had anomalies that eventually broke down, Neo being a culmination of the anomalies. In this new matrix, by having Neo and Trinity separate but next to each other, constantly yearning for each other, it solidified the system and allowed the matrix to do away with the anomalies as people finally accepted it. Now, it's a silly idea in the movie, but the general metaphor is that if men and women don't desire each other, your civilization will collapse. Fighting will erupt. Politics will become imbalanced. And I think that's a fair point. I actually agree with it. I believe, as I've stated, you need an honest balance between masculine and feminine energies. And for a long time, we had nothing but masculine energies. Now we're shifting towards the feminine, and I don't think that's going to help us at all. In the article from the New York Times, they point out that there's a pacifying effect to women in politics. I think that makes sense. I really do. It makes sense to me, and maybe it's not right, that with a hardcore patriarchy and less women involved in politics, you're more likely to get risk-taking. So you're going to end up with more chaotic outcomes. Harder to predict. Warfare, for instance. When you bring women into the picture, there's more of a desire for safety, which means there will be a pacifying effect saying, do not go to war if we don't have to. That can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. But You get an inversion of this problem when you only have safety. You get people unwilling to take risks to challenge things that need to be challenged. And thus you end up with authoritarianism. You end up with communism and corporatism. You end up with people, with people voting for or supporting lockdowns, mandates, etc., which destroy lives. So it's, in my opinion, I look back at tribal warfare and things like this, and I don't know exactly what it was like, but you did have a matriarch and a patriarch. After a long enough period of time, conflict started to arise. Men became, more dominant in politics than women to a certain degree. Of course, women always played a role in politics, and thus you ended up with conquest, war, and conflict. Some may argue that actually greatly benefited mankind, but there also was a lot of death. So I actually think we can slow down. We can have progress without burning the system down. We can recognize that conflict is a natural part of life, be it in the animal kingdom or in human civilization. And we can also recognize that we need to have that balance of masculine energy and feminine energy. The point is, I see this article from the New York Times, and they say women overwhelmingly favor banning hate speech. That's what we're seeing now in our civilization. Big tech companies have an overwhelmingly feminine presence and energy, and they don't care. They want safety and security. They don't want to take risks. Me? I'm open to taking risks. I can appreciate and respect the position, but I think risk-taking is the appropriate response. The scientific data shows this. Of course, there are men who want safety. Of course, there are women who want risks, but there's a tendency. I think that tendency is easily reflected by biology, evolutionary biology, and psychology. And I think we need to consider these factors as we watch what's going on. In no way do I think this solves any of the problems. I suppose it's just interesting to assess. That's about it. There are some people who say things like repeal the 19th. I don't agree with that. I certainly think there's an issue, though, when you have low testosterone males just blindly siding with women because they think it'll get them laid. That creates an imbalance. No, we need a good balance of masculine and feminine energy because we are one species of people that have men and women, and we all play a role in the society. Giving a role to any one sex, race, or religion, I think is a bad idea. Hey, I guess what I'm saying is real diversity of thought and opinion helps make us stronger. What we have right now is not that. We have homogenization. We have racial and gender homogenization. That's not a good thing. The left will deny it because they don't want to believe it, but their overt tribalism and adherence to authority is burning everything down. I'll leave it there. Hey, just a fun Friday segment, I guess. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.